Retirement, or the very thought of retirement, brings to the surface many questions you may never have considered before, such as, when do I take Social Security? How do I handle required minimum distributions? Do I need long-term care insurance? Well, if any of those have crossed your mind, then stay tuned to this week's episode of the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. And welcome to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm David Scranton, here with my good friend and co-host Sarah Samuels. And today, we're just going to cover a bunch of basic questions that you may not have thought about until you got really close to retirement, or for some of you, maybe in retirement, but questions and things that you should be considering along the way. So, Sarah, I know we always have often one topic often for a show, but today it's kind of like a whole bunch of different thoughts for our listeners that maybe they can get some help in making decisions, or even realize there's some decisions that are going to have to be made that they may not even thought about yet.
That's right, Dave. Well, today's show is sort of a grab bag of different retirement questions and different retirement topics. So thank you so much to all of our listeners for joining us this weekend to listen to this, because I think, Dave, this show is extremely important for people that kind of want a 30,000-foot view, right? They want a nice overhead, an overlook at every single topic that really goes into retirement, everything they really should consider. That way they don't have to worry about missing anything. But Dave, speaking of missing anything, did you have a nice weekend?
Yeah, it was kind of nondescript, actually.
Okay.
Kind of a peaceful weekend.
Very nice.
Worked a little bit, but not as much as I normally do. So just kind of a peaceful weekend. I felt myself actually decompressing on Sunday, which is kind of nice. How about you?
Yeah. Well, Dave, I'm actually surprised by that, because I know Teresa just came back from Connecticut, so I'm surprised she's letting you relax on the weekends.
Yeah.
She doesn't have a honey-do list.
Well,
for
we
you?
thought about for those of you listeners that don't know, of course, we're here in Southern Florida, and the big Art Basel Festival was down in Miami this weekend. So we actually thought about that. But, first weekend in, and then fighting the traffic down to Miami and back and everything else, we just kind of decided, we're going to skip it. But we thought about it.
Yeah, it's one of those things you think about it, and then you think about the traffic and the crowds and dealing with Miami, and it's you think about it again. But yeah, I had a pretty nice weekend too. It was laid back, so both of us pretty relaxing weekend. So and Dave, speaking of what's going on too with the markets, it looks like they're still cooperating. It looks like things are still doing okay. I know we talked about this last week too, that the markets were doing better after it seemed like the Fed, they signaled no more raising of the interest rates. Yeah,
and like we discussed, retirees have a great opportunity now, while the market is still reasonably high, maybe not at the record high, but within 3-4% of the record high, to start to position themselves more for income as they get close to retirement or in retirement, because the market values are high. Interest rates are high. They seem to be topped out, in theory at least, and at some point are going to come back down again. So it's really a perfect time for people to make that also important transition from being total return focused, irregardless of whether it comes from, and I hate that word, irregardless. I just said that. That's bad grammar.
That's Miami.
I meant regardless. Yes, that's right. Regardless of whether it comes from interest or dividends, to a focus that's more income first and growth second.
Yeah, absolutely, Dave. Well, speaking of income, Social Security is supposedly it's a form of income that lasts until the rest of your life that you can count on. But our next Ask Dave question actually has to do with taking Social Security benefits early. So we have Kyle from Texas. He says, I'm 62. I haven't saved enough for retirement. So I'm thinking if I take my Social Security benefits now, then I can invest the money. And I think that might help me grow my investment or grow my retirement savings. Is this a good strategy?
Kyle, great question. And I've heard that logic so many times before with people who are thinking about, hey, I'm a little behind the eight ball in saving. Can this work? So in most cases, the answer is no. And why is that? Well, first of all, it has to do with life expectancy, right? If you have reason to believe that you're not going to live to average life expectancy because of heredity or your current medical situation, then okay, maybe it's something to consider. Right? But if you have no reason to believe that you won't make it till average life expectancy or even beyond, then the problem is twofold. Number one, if you're working, you're going to have to most likely pay taxes on that. So you're going to have to pay taxes on the benefits when you get it. Number two, you might have to pay some of those Social Security benefits back because you're still working and making income. And number three, and perhaps most important, is that your Social Security goes up between 7 and 8% guaranteed. The benefits go up 7, 8% a year guaranteed for every year that you delay it. It's closer to 7% earlier on and then goes to 8% later. So that means you need to get, even if you're not paying your Social Security back or you're not paying any taxes on it, you need to get 7 or 8% net of taxes on your investments to just match what Social Security can do. So again, Kyle, just a whole bunch of reasons why it's the best advice is probably not to rush it, to take some time and just let that 7, 8% grow. It's great guaranteed return in terms of the increase you can get in your benefits if you wait to a later date.
Very good. Well, Kyle, thank you so much for sending in your Ask Dave question. And if any of our listeners have a question about retirement or even finances that you want to send in, all you have to do is send us an email at askdave@retirementincomesource. That's SOURCE.com. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and today's show, we're calling it a grab bag of different retirement topics. So we are looking at a lot of different things that go into your retirement planning strategy. So we're talking about Social Security benefits, when's the right time to take them. We're also going to take a look at long-term care. Plus, we'll probably talk about some RMDs and taxes as well and how all of that plays a role. But speaking of Social Security, Dave, we just had a question from Kyle. He said, I haven't saved enough, and he mentioned that he was thinking he would take his benefits early, invest them, and use that money to grow his account. So you said probably not a great strategy, but what would be a better strategy maybe for someone in Kyle's position?
Well, first of all, regarding Social Security, the best, if you're going to live past life expectancy, you get those annual payments for longer. If you think you might, or you think you or your spouse might, well, then it makes sense usually to delay benefits a bit. But in Kyle's case, and I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but if you're still working and you take it before your full retirement age, which is 66 or 67, then in his case, it'll be 67, I believe, then he's going to have to pay part of that benefit back unless he's really at poverty level in terms of his income. And even if he has a low income, he still is likely to have to pay taxes on a bunch of it. So it just doesn't make sense to have all that drain when you can get a guaranteed 7 to 8% increase in your benefit net of taxes, each and every year. So I agree with what you said that. Yeah. And by the way, it's not for everyone. Yeah. There are some people that are retired at 62. They're not working. They don't have to worry about benefit reductions. They don't have to worry about the taxation. And maybe they do believe that, hey, nobody in my family made it, out of their early 70s, so let me take it now. And maybe they're single, so they don't have to worry about a spouse, or their spouse has a higher benefit. So it makes sense to take it early. Yeah. And that's why for us, to me, you always run it through a Social Security calculator. Because, Sarah, we've talked about this a lot before, how Social Security, you call them and they're not allowed to give advice, right? So, and they have a few calculators on their website, but they're very rudimentary. Right. Financial advisors who specialize in income have calculators that are more robust, where we can really put somebody's data, and any good income specialist is able to put somebody's personal data in the system and show you hundreds of different ways to take Social Security, so you can see which of the ways are likely to generate more money for you over the course of your life versus which of the ways that might give a little less money, so you could start to make some good decisions. And but you did ask me a question about Kyle, and I want to answer that in just a moment, in terms of what else our good friend Kyle, who just wrote in, what he could do to get ahead of it if he's feeling a little bit behind the 8 ball. So we're going to cover that, as well as these thoughts about how to cover catastrophic medical costs in retirement. All that and more coming up. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels, and this is the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income.
Welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with Dave Scranton, and we're talking about several different retirement topics that are all very important if you are at or near that age and planning for your retirement. So we've talked a little bit about Social Security and specifically Social Security benefits. We actually had an Ask Dave question from Kyle, who's 62 years old. His strategy was that he should take his Social Security benefits now and then reinvest that money and hope it grows so we could have more money in savings. Now, Dave, you kind of did the politician thing a little bit there, where you didn't really answer my question about what should someone do if they are in Kyle's place. If they're 62, they need income. And they don't think they've saved enough, but they need income.
Yeah.
What should they do?
Yeah, I kind of did poo on your question, didn't I? I got back. I was so excited about Social Security and talking about that, because Social Security is like the one benefit that almost all of us have in retirement. It's the one thing common to everybody that oftentimes is misunderstood. But in Kyle's situation, there's a few answers to that. One is defense, right? When you retire, it's not just about offense and how much income you have. It's defense. It's how low your expenses are. So if Kyle's carrying a lot of debt, I mean, I don't know that, but if he is, put a plan together to get that debt paid down, because now he needs less income in retirement, and that's a big part of it. If he can get it paid down while he's still working, now he can put more money into his 401k. Max out those 401k. Kyle's over the age of 50. He could do catch-up provisions. He could put even more money in the 401k than the average person. And just get that money stuffed in there so that he gets as far ahead of it as possible. Now, he won't have a lot of time to let that money compound and grow, but you can't turn back the clock,
Right.
and you can't beat yourself up over it. You have to do the best with what you have now. And the best thing for Kyle right now is to, make sure that he's not going to be laden with debt in retirement, hopefully get debt-free earlier so he can save more money, max out those 401k contributions wherever he possibly can, max out Roth IRA contributions if he can do that also, put money in a Roth IRA, and then start to think about retirement and start to think about, okay, geographically, where was Kyle from, by the way? I forgot.
I think Texas. Yes, Texas. Sorry.
Okay. So Kyle, you have to think a little bit about, two, are you in a place in Texas where your dollar goes further, or maybe moving in retirement might make more sense so you can stretch that dollar further? Kyle might want to think about his home, right? Is this the home you want to be in, or do you want to downsize and save some money in retirement? Right, that's another thought. So again, it's offense and defense, and it's starting to plan ahead. If you're behind the eight ball, we had what was a year ago, we had a show on the tiny houses, right?
Right. Yeah.
And even that, how do you really live cost effectively? Because again, if you don't have time on your side, you haven't saved enough, then it becomes more about defense than offense.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of offense, let's talk about healthcare, because that is one of those things. We know that the rate of healthcare inflation increases way more, way higher than the regular rate of inflation. So we actually have a question here. Elizabeth from Virginia, she says, long-term care insurance is very expensive. How much money would I need if I wanted to self-insure?
All right. What's your name again?
Elizabeth.
Okay. See, I ask you, I'm trying to keep you on your toes with what state they're from and their names and all
Elizabeth
this.
from Virginia.
So Elizabeth, there's no exact number, but you have to look and say, how much is a convalescent facility in my area if I need full-time care? And if you know you can get a 4 or 5% interest or dividend payment today, just take that annual cost, divide it by 0.05, and that's the number. So if it's $150,000 per year, you might need as much as $3 million to cover it. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, that's paying for it off interest and dividends. I get that. And you may be thinking, I don't want to leave a big legacy to my family. I don't really care. I get that also. But still, inflation on medical costs is much, much higher than your regular CPI, your regular rate of inflation. So by time if you have enough income now potentially generated from your portfolio to cover the costs today, chances are that income will not keep up with the increased cost down the road by the time you actually need this care. So that increase can then start to come out of principal and spend down your principal. But I think it's faulty to say, okay, I've got $1.5 million and I could pay for convalescent care or full-time home health care now for 10 years because, 1.5 divided by 150 gives me 10 years, because that's not really the case with healthcare inflation. But that's a great goal. And if you're not at that level, Elizabeth, if you're not at the level where you can self-insure, then stay tuned, because later on in the show, we're going to talk about other ways that might be just a little bit more cost-effective, where you can give yourself some protection against medical catastrophes down the road, and maybe partially self-insure and partially outsource it.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for sending in your Ask Dave question. And if any of our listeners or our YouTube viewers have a question about retirement or maybe a financial strategy or about the income strategy, all you have to do is send us an email at askdave@retirementincomesource.com. Thank you for listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and we're covering a wide variety of retirement topics on today's show. So far we've talked about Social Security, we've talked about benefits, the idea of taking benefits early in order to reinvest them and figuring out when is the best time and circumstances for you to take your Social Security benefits. Plus, Dave, we also are talking about long-term care. You mentioned we might talk about other alternatives to long-term care, but can you give a little explainer to our listeners, our viewers who maybe, they're not 100% sure what long-term care insurance actually is?
Sure. And one of the big misnomers is that you have Medicare, you're all set. Well, that's really not true. You could have Medicare Part A, which covers hospitalization, Medicare Part B, which covers doctors. And there are a lot of gaps within that coverage. But then you can get Medicare supplement insurance, gap coverage, and it fills in a lot of the gaps. But one gap it doesn't fill in is home health care or convalescent care. So generally speaking, and not everyone qualifies for this, but the most you can get for convalescent care or home health care, the most is 100 days between Medicare and all those supplements. So if you have a long-term situation, be it dementia or Alzheimer's or something as you get on in years, there's no way to cover it. And, convalescent care, we said, could be certainly in the six figures. Full-time home health care could be a lot more. And the reality of it, Sarah, is that, I bet if you were to survey all of our listeners, I don't think there's one single person who on their list of retirement goals is to move to a convalescent home.
No, I don't think so.
Right?
Not one of those state-run homes, those.
Yeah. And people bury their head in the sand because the insurance, as Elizabeth said, is expensive, right? So they bury their head in the sands, and they never want to think about these nasty things happening. So it's even, people set up a will and trust earlier because, I might get, run over by a car and die instantaneously. So it's not that scary to even think about that sometimes. But going to a convalescent home is scary. So people do bury their heads in the sand. And I just urge people not to do that. To figure out, okay, how much do I think I can self-insure? And then what do I do with the rest? Do I go out to insurance companies? What do I do? Because, the big issue, Sarah, is that you can't, if you spend down all your money and you're out of money and you have no long-term care benefits, most states will force you into a convalescent facility. So you can stay in the comfort of your home as long as you can afford it. But when you go on the state tab, what's called Medicaid funding, then you're in a home. You no longer have your independence. And that's a scary thought for most people.
Yep. Well, it's especially scary, Dave, when you consider that about 7 out of 10 people who are age 65 or older now are going to need this long-term care, and I understand a lot of people don't want to think about it. It's scary to think about getting older and being in a situation where you might need that care, but it's so important to make a plan now and to think about what your strategy is going to be for your health care, for your insurance.
And not only is it that high of a percentage, but the average length of stay in a facility for those people that do need it is about 3 years.
Right.
That's a long time.
A little longer than the 100 days, right? Between Medicare and all the supplements. So maybe you don't want to get long-term care insurance, though. Maybe you're interested in other alternatives to kind of hedge against this healthcare inflation. Well, you're in luck because we're going to talk about that and give you some alternatives to the long-term care insurance. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and you're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and we appreciate you listening to our show this weekend as we're covering a wide variety of important retirement topics. So we've talked a little bit about Social Security, why it might not be such a great idea to take your Social Security benefits, especially if you're still working. We also talked about long-term care versus self-insuring. And Dave, as you know, and I hope our listeners know, healthcare inflation is no joke. It rises much faster than the regular rate of inflation. So you have to think about your health when you're planning for retirement.
Yeah. And, it's everybody looks at the cost of long-term care insurance and says it's too expensive, and that's why they don't want to do it. But the reason it's expensive is because statistics that we talked about just in the last block, right? Where, 2/3 of the people are going to need it at some point, need full-time home health care or convalescent care. And the average length of that need is about 3 years. That's a lot of dough. That's almost like, you're going to be paying out $500,000 at some point. But the problem is people always think, well, what if I don't need it? What if it turns out that I'm okay? What do I do? So there are a few alternatives, right?
So what are these alternatives if you don't want to go with long-term care insurance?
First of all, there's a lot of insurance and annuity products that have that as a side benefit. So for example, there's some annuity products which will guarantee you a certain amount of income. But if all of a sudden you can't do certain, they call it activities of daily living, which are like, feeding yourself and bathing yourself and transferring and all that, right? If you can't do that, well, then they'll double the income or triple the income. So it's not as sure as long-term care insurance, the regular style you pay for every year, but it gives you some benefit. There's some cash value life policies that have a rider on it too, where you can pay over time. It's a life insurance, but the rider says that, hey, a good chunk of this death benefit could be paid out for long-term care if you need it. That's another way of doing it. Then there are some that are lump sum based, where you write a check for, let's say, $100,000 or $200,000. It's got to be non-IRA money, generally speaking. And it gives you a certain amount of long-term care benefit. But let's say you put in $100,000. It might say, okay, if you live and you want to cash it out, you can always get your $100,000 back. If you die, your heirs will get $200,000. If you need money for full-time home health care or convalescent care, it might be $300,000. So what that does is that often solves the need of what if I don't need it, right? Because people never think about that. They pay the car insurance and they're not ticked off they didn't get into an accident last year, right? They pay for the homeowner's insurance. They're not ticked off because their house didn't burn down. But because the premiums are so high for this particular thing, they feel like they're going to waste a lot of money if they don't use it. So again, there's some alternatives that give people a little more flexibility. In many cases, Sarah, people have enough assets to partially self-insure. As I mentioned before with Elizabeth, my gut instinct tells me you probably need close to $3 million or more to actually fully self-insure. So if you have less, you could partially self-insure, but then you can use some of these other tools to maybe cover some of the gap. And that often can work.
Well, Dave, you mentioned that some people, if they purchase different annuities, they purchase different types of insurance, and maybe they don't need it. They get lucky, right? They don't have any major health issues, and they're very fortunate. And maybe they want to pass it along to their family. They want to leave a legacy. So I feel like that really goes with our next question, our next Ask Dave question, which is about estate planning and part of leaving a legacy. So we have a question from Allison in New York. She says, how important is it for me to have a living trust?
All right, Allison. Well, I guess it depends on a few things. So let's talk about what a trust in general does, right? A trust in general is, the theory of it is to be able to run your money from the grave, okay? So that instead of just giving everything to everyone outright, that you can say, here, these are stipulations as to when people receive cash and when they don't. And you can be as creative as you want, okay? But in the case of a living trust, a lot of people just do a living trust because they want to avoid probate. Now, Allison, if you think, well, gosh, I've got a will, I'm all set. Well, think again, because when you have a will, your assets go through probate. In fact, the purpose of probate is to prove, that's where the word comes from. Probate comes from probare in Latin, which means to prove. It's to prove that this last will and testament that was presented to the court after your death is the actual and the real and the latest last will and testament. That is literally the last will and testament. That's the probate process. So if you want to avoid probate, a living trust is one way to do it. But it's not the only way to do it. And if you stay with us, we'll talk later about why you might want to avoid probate. But you may not need a trust to do that. For example, any retirement assets, IRAs, 401ks, annuities, any life insurance, you can name a beneficiary, and that money avoids probate at your death. It goes right to the beneficiary. You can have a brokerage account or a bank account and have it what's called TOD, transfer on death, or POD, payable on death. Depending upon what state you live in, it's called two different things, but you're naming a beneficiary and it avoids probate. And Allison, every state's different. I'm not sure about your state, but even a lot of real estate can be transferred at death right by the deed, written in the deed. So again, you may or may not need a living trust. There's lots of benefits to living trust. Again, stay tuned. We'll talk more about that coming up just in the next few minutes.
And Allison, thank you so much for sending in your question. If any of our listeners or even our YouTube viewers have a question for Dave, all you have to do is send us an email to askdave@retirementincomesource. That's SOURCE.com. Thank you for listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with Dave Scranton, and we are talking about several different topics, all related to retirement and planning for your retirement strategy. So we've talked about Social Security benefits, when is the right time, and different things you should consider when thinking about if it's time to take your Social Security benefits. Plus, we've talked about long-term care. And Dave, you just answered a question that I thought was a really important question about a living trust. And you mentioned, that there are other ways. A living trust, one of the benefits, of course, is that you can avoid the probate process, which you'll still have to go through if you have a will. But you mentioned there's some other ways to avoid this probate process that are not just a living trust.
Right, yeah. And those can be used. It gets a little more challenging, though, because you have to have everything line up. Your state has to allow TODs or PODs. You've got to stay current with all your beneficiaries. So you have to go around, and if you want to change your beneficiary, you have to change it with everything. Whereas in many cases with a trust, you simply just change the beneficiary in the trust, and it's that simple. Yeah. Also, if you own any real estate outside your state of residence, you probably want a trust, because then it has to go through what's called ancillary probate. So your heirs would have to go through probate in your state of residence and also in the other state. Or if just your state of residence is one that's different from where your executor is. Now your executor, has to travel to work the probate. So there's lots of areas of complexity there. In most cases, the living trust just is the easier way to do it. Yep. And it doesn't have to spend that much money. I mean, if you shop around for a couple $1,000s, you can get a will, a living trust, but also some other important documents, right? A durable power of attorney. If you become unable to manage your financial affairs, you name somebody to do it. A designation of healthcare agent, so that you designate somebody to make healthcare decisions for you, again, if you're unable. And a living will, which says, pull the plug and not pull the plug. Those are all documents that are important together. And Sarah, I find the reason this comes up in retirement is because a lot of people have wills they set up when they had young children. Yep. And, okay, their children are grown. So a lot of the features in there really aren't relevant anymore. And also, a lot of times you have people that, beneficiaries have predeceased them, executors have predeceased them. Maybe they're not even really in touch with that executor anymore, or that trustee. Time to change it. So most people find that right about retirement, that's the time that they want to get their ducks in a row, not just with Social Security and planning for medical catastrophe, but also with estate planning.
Yeah, especially when it comes to retirement, a lot of different things start to happen, right? When you reach age 73, you have to take those required minimum distributions. So you have to consider all of these different things that are coming down the pipeline when you're at that retirement age. So it's a great time to take a look at everything and get everything updated. So Dave, when it comes to paying those RMDs, though, you're going to have to satisfy them one way, right? Through interest and dividends. But how do you actually make the interest and dividends on your investments? How do you generate that income? Well, Dave is going to go over that. We're going to give you some tips next. I'm Sarah Samuels here with Dave Scranton, and you're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income.
And welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels. And today we're addressing some very important questions or things that you need to consider at or around retirement time. So far, we've covered Social Security, how to make the Social Security decision, at least in general, and how for most people, unless you think you're not going to live to average life expectancy, it probably makes sense to delay Social Security benefits as long as you comfortably can. Then what about major healthcare catastrophes, right? Big surprise here, but Medicare Part B supplements don't cover convalescent care or full-time home health care beyond 100 days. So how to protect yourself from that also. And then estate planning. A lot of people's estate plans, by the time they get to retirement, are 2 or 3 or 4 decades old and really should be updated. But now, Sarah, we were just getting into, or at least you promised our listeners we'd talk for a few minutes about required minimum distributions, which is the other decision currently has to happen at age 73. And for some people in the early 60s, they might not have to worry about that till 75, but you do have to start planning ahead for it.
Yep. It's one of those things that you have to think about in the beginning, maybe right at the time of retirement, this 5 to 10 years out for retirement. That way you don't get in a situation and you're having to withdraw principal from your accounts in order to pay these RMDs. So, Dave, how do you properly plan for RMDs? What's a good strategy if you're 60, 62, and these are coming up 10 years down the road?
Well, the first thing, and we'll talk about taxes first and everything, but you have to realize that as your IRA grows, that these required minimum distributions are going to be forced to come out. Why? Because the government wants their tax revenue, right? The government's worst fear is you live to be 100 and you defer your IRA or 401k the entire time, and they don't get their tax money until you're 100. So they want you to take these minimum distributions starting currently at age 73. And they start at about 4% of the account. So if you have $1 million, that's 40 grand a year. But if you're in your early 60s, well, that million may grow to 2, and now it's 80,000 a year. And with that, of course, and then all of a sudden that's going to cause your Social Security to be taxed. As much as 85% of your Social Security will have to be claimed as taxable income, plus whatever sources you have. So you have to plan ahead and look at your tax brackets to say, hey, do I want to wait until that point, or do I want to start taking money out of my IRA and 401k first, or do I want to consider some Roth conversions? Sarah, we talk about a lot in the show that a lot of people will try to do some Roth conversions strategically in younger years, pay taxes on the IRA, so that once it's in the Roth IRA, it can grow tax-free forever for them and for their heirs. And also, there's no required minimum distributions when you're in a Roth IRA. So again, a lot of planning has to be done pretty early on, or you can get surprised in your mid-70s with somewhat of a tax time bomb.
Yep. And we don't want our listeners, our viewers, to get surprised with any sort of time tax bomb. So our Ask Dave question has to do with this topic. So let's get our question. We have it, Janice from Arizona. She says, most of my money is in IRA assets, and I'm worried about the government forcing me to spend it down. And if that happens, I won't be able to self-insure against medical expenses. What should I do?
Yeah, you won't be able to self-insure against medical expenses. You probably don't even have to worry about estate planning, right? We talked about just in the last segment, because you may not have an estate if you live long enough, right? I get all that. So great question. And here is the key, okay? The key is that you have a choice. And most people don't realize that you have a choice, but they have a choice. Are they going to invest in such a way so that they can satisfy those required minimum distributions, those IRA withdrawals from interest and dividends? Or are they going to let the government force them to take those distributions out of principal? Because if the distributions come out of principal, you're simply taking money out of the right pocket, putting it in the left pocket, but oops, there's a little hole, and that's the taxes you have to pay. So your net worth is going down, down, down because of the taxes, and you're shifting money from the right to the left. And with inflation, by the time you get in your mid to late 80s, if you do need home health care, guess what? Now you have less money than you did at age 73, but the cost of home health care might be double in your mid-late 80s what it was at age 73. So you're really fighting two battles. However, if you can earn enough interest and dividends to satisfy those required minimum distributions, then you're not taking money out of your right pocket. Your right pocket is just earning some interest, and you're moving that interest to your left pocket. So even though you have to pay some tax on that interest that you withdraw, still your net worth is going up because you're not just shifting from one to another. That right pocket is earning enough interest and dividends that's payable to you that you can take and use for that forced distribution. And that's important because growth, let's make no bones about it. You can't sell growth. If you're not earning enough interest and dividends, then what you're doing is you're hoping that your IRA grows enough in value that you can chop off part of it and it'll grow back the next year. Well, that's like saying, gosh, I'm gonna chop off a finger and hope it grows back. Not a great strategy.
Well, Janice, thank you for sending in your Ask Dave question. And if any of our listeners have a question about your retirement or maybe a financial strategy or maybe something you heard in the media, please send us your questions via email, askdave@retirementincomesource.com. Thank you for spending your weekend here with us on the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels, and I'm here with Dave Scranton. And today's show has really been a grab bag of different retirement topics. So if you have different retirement questions, if you're curious about Social Security, if you're thinking about long-term care insurance, today's show has been a show for for you. So, Dave, we've talked about all of these different things. We've talked about RMDs, required minimum distributions. Nobody wants to be forced to spend down their money. Plus, you mentioned a great point, which is if you rely on this withdrawal strategy as your main retirement plan, by the time you get to your 80s and 90s and you need that money in order to draw down in order to pay for expenses, you might not have anything left. As opposed to income, you're earning interest and dividends, and you're using that money to pay your RMDs. You're using that money to pay for your expenses. So you still have your nest egg when you're in your 80s or 90s.
Yeah. Well, as we say 8 times every single week, it's all about the income,
Exactly,
right, Sarah?
all about the income.
And even if you're working, you may say, it's not about the income. I'm like Dave Scranton. I run my own business. I love my life. I'm going to work forever, even though that's you got to be careful there because, you don't know if you're going to be in good health long enough to work forever. But let's say you do want to work up to age 80 or in your 80s, and you can do that. Well, still you have this issue of these RMDs. The government's forcing you to take those withdrawals. And if you take them out of principle, what you're really doing is like digging up gold in your backyard and moving it from one hole, putting it in another hole, but oops, some of the gold's got to go to the IRS. So the amount of gold in your backyard is going down. It's less and less, right? But imagine instead that you have a renewable resource where, let's say that gold, we're paying you interest. I know gold doesn't pay interest, so bad analogy. Let's say it did. Yeah. And now you just took the interest and moved it over to the other hole. Sure, a little bit of that interest has to go to tax, but you haven't touched the amount of the original resource you have buried in the ground in your backyard. So that resource is going up and up and up versus going down and down and down. Now, Sarah, it's important, I think, for everybody to realize that the required minimum distributions as a percentage of your IRA balance do go up as you get older. So eventually you're going to get to an age where you probably can't satisfy it from interest and dividends. It's going to be too much. But instead of hitting that at age 73, what if you could postpone that into your mid-80s so your IRA can keep growing into your mid-80s in spite of these government-forced distributions? Then, if you have to start taking some out of principle towards your later 80s and your 90s, it's not quite as bad because you've given it more momentum to grow.
Plus, the biggest thing, Dave, you mentioned you have your savings at the end of it. And I know that a lot of our listeners, they are doing retirement planning because they want to leave a legacy. And we touched on estate planning and the pieces of estate planning earlier, but they want to leave money to their kids. They want to leave some sort of legacy. And that's another reason why income investing or investing for income is so important because it allows you that ability if you want to do so.
100%. Or even just inflation, right? If you think about RMDs, the percentage of the RMD goes up. But if you're taking out a principal and the balance is going down, your actual income might stay the same. So I don't want somebody in their 60s spending principal, right? But let's say inflation starts to get a lot tighter from your 60s to your 70s into your 80s. Well, if you're in your mid-80s or so and you need to take some principal because inflation is putting a bit of a stranglehold on you, well, then you want to know that you've got as much principal intact by the time you get to your mid-80s so you can start to take some as that inflation hedge. Because otherwise there's no guarantee on an inflation hedge with virtually any asset. It provides income, right? I mean, bonds don't, preferreds don't. You can do it organically by reinvesting some of that stuff and not spending it all. But even high dividend common stocks, right? Stocks generally don't do well in an inflationary environment. So keeping that principle intact is important for all those reasons.
Yep. Well, it's a good retirement strategy focuses on both the offense and the defense, but most importantly, the defense. So if you're looking for an income specialist, someone who can help you make sure that you are set up the best way possible with your Social Security benefits, with taking your RMDs, please check out the retirementincomesource.com. We have a map there, and you can see all of our income specialists across the country and find someone in your area.
Yeah, and most importantly, we hope that you're here to join us once again next week, same time, same station. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels, and this is the Retirement Income Source where, for the 8th time, it is all about the income.